"She's just staff," Ethan Caldwell said without looking up, his voice calm enough to sting more than a shout ever could. The words drifted across the polished walnut conference table and settled into the silence like dust in sunlight. A few executives exchanged restrained smiles while others returned to their tablets, already convinced the woman carrying a silver coffee tray had nothing meaningful to contribute. Naomi Brooks neither slowed her pace nor changed her expression. She continued placing porcelain cups in front of each guest with steady hands, the faint aroma of dark roast coffee mixing with the cool scent of leather chairs and fresh-cut lilies, arranged beneath the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Outside, late morning sunlight reflected off neighboring glass towers, turning the skyline into a field of shimmering mirrors. Inside, the room belonged to people who measured success in market shares, acquisition percentages, and numbers too large for most Americans to imagine. The deal scheduled for 11 o'clock carried a reported value of $1.3 billion, enough to dominate financial headlines before dinner. Ethan adjusted the cuff of his tailored navy suit and glanced toward the international delegation assembling across the table. Every movement suggested confidence earned through decades of winning. Every eye in the room followed him, except Naomi's. Her attention lingered for the briefest moment on the thick binder resting beside the lead negotiator's seat. A blue tab marked the signature pages. Another tab, farther back, had been folded twice instead of once. It was a tiny detail, easy to miss, unless someone had spent years noticing details no one else considered important. She set the final cup beside an empty chair and quietly stepped back against the wall where service staff were expected to disappear into the background. Ethan continued speaking about projections, quarterly expansion, and strategic partnerships, while digital charts illuminated the massive display behind him. The executives nodded in practiced rhythm. Pens tapped lightly against legal pads. Ice clinked inside crystal water glasses. Somewhere beyond the closed doors, an elevator chimed before fading into silence again. Then the guests from Zurich entered. 3 men and 1 woman walked into the boardroom with measured confidence, carrying slim black portfolios instead of bulky briefcases. Their leader, gray-haired and remarkably composed, paused just inside the doorway. His eyes scanned the room once, not the presentation screen. Not Ethan Caldwell. Not the attorneys seated nearest the contracts. He appeared to be searching for someone else entirely. "Good morning," Ethan greeted, extending a welcoming smile. "We're honored to have you here." The visitor returned the handshake politely, but his attention drifted beyond the billion-dollar presentation, beyond the executives lined along the table, settling for less than a second on the woman standing quietly beside the coffee cart. Naomi lowered her eyes before anyone noticed the exchange. Or at least she hoped they hadn't. The visitor looked back toward Ethan. "Before we begin," he said in a measured tone, "I was expecting someone." Ethan smiled with effortless confidence. "Everyone essential is already here." The visitor's expression remained unreadable. "I'm not entirely certain that's true." A faint crease formed between Ethan's eyebrows, though his smile never disappeared. Around the room, curiosity flickered across polished faces. No one spoke. No one moved. Naomi tightened her fingers gently around the silver tray, its reflective surface catching a beam of sunlight that briefly illuminated the simple black name tag pinned to her uniform. It read only 2 words: Naomi Brooks. The room remained perfectly still after the visitor's unexpected remark, as though every person present was waiting for someone else to explain what had just happened. Ethan Caldwell recovered first, offering the confident smile that had carried him through countless negotiations. "Perhaps there has been a misunderstanding," he said warmly. "Our executive team is ready to begin whenever you are." The visitor acknowledged the comment with a slight nod but did not sit down. Instead, he slowly removed his gloves, placing them neatly beside a slim leather portfolio before looking once more around the boardroom. Naomi Brooks quietly lifted the empty coffee pot from the serving cart, careful not to disturb the silence. Years of working in luxury hotels had taught her how to become almost invisible, how to move through rooms where billion-dollar conversations happened without ever becoming part of them. Yet, something about the visitor's careful observation unsettled her. He was not studying titles or expensive watches. He watched people. The attorneys shuffled papers while financial analysts opened spreadsheets across polished tablets. Someone adjusted the thermostat by a single degree, and the faint hum of the ventilation system filled the brief silence. Ethan motioned toward the presentation screen. Our projections demonstrate a 22% increase in market value over the next 36 months. Charts filled the display with rising blue lines and optimistic forecasts. The international delegation watched politely, but their leader barely glanced at the numbers. His attention lingered instead on the thick contract binder resting near Ethan's elbow. Naomi noticed the same folded blue tab she had spotted moments earlier. It bothered her more now than before. During her years reviewing acquisition documents, small physical habits often revealed rushed revisions, overlooked clauses, or last-minute edits hidden inside hundreds of pages. She reminded herself that none of this concerned her anymore. That chapter of her life had ended years earlier. She was here to refill coffee, collect empty cups, and leave through the service elevator before lunch. Still, her eyes returned to the binder. Ethan confidently turned another presentation slide. Our legal department has already completed every compliance review. Several executives nodded in agreement. One attorney even smiled with quiet satisfaction. The visitor finally spoke. That is reassuring. His voice remained calm, almost gentle, because our board believes details matter far more than presentations. Ethan chuckled politely. On that point, we completely agree. Naomi reached for a pitcher of ice water, stopping only long enough to notice one page inside the binder had shifted slightly when Ethan moved his arm. A narrow strip of highlighted text became visible for less than a second before disappearing again. She caught only a few words, but they were enough to make her heart beat slow instead of quicken. Not panic, recognition. She had seen language like that before, years ago, in another glass tower, another boardroom, another transaction that nearly collapsed because one sentence meant something entirely different from what inexperienced readers believed. Naomi lowered her eyes immediately, reminding herself that she no longer worked in mergers and acquisitions. She no longer advised investment boards. She no longer carried responsibility for contracts measured in billions. She carried coffee trays. Nothing more. The visitor gently closed his portfolio without opening it. Before anyone signs today, he said quietly, there is one question I would like answered. Around the table, every executive straightened in anticipation. Ethan folded his hands confidently. Of course. The visitor looked directly across the room, past every vice president, every attorney, and every consultant. His gaze settled once again on Naomi. May I ask how long Miss Brooks has been with your organization? For the first time that morning, Ethan Caldwell allowed genuine confusion to surface across his face. He followed the visitor's line of sight until it landed on Naomi Brooks, who still stood quietly beside the serving cart, with both hands resting lightly on its polished handle. Several executives glanced toward her before exchanging puzzled looks. One of the attorneys gave a polite laugh. Miss Brooks does not work for Caldwell Global, he explained. She is part of the hospitality team assigned to today's meeting. The visitor remained silent for a moment, as though weighing every word before speaking again. I did not ask where she receives her paycheck, he replied calmly. I asked how long she has been with your organization. The distinction settled over the room like a slow-moving storm. Ethan answered carefully. Our company has used this hotel's executive conference services for several years. I believe I have seen her here before, although I cannot say exactly how long. Naomi lowered her eyes respectfully. She had indeed served coffee in dozens of meetings over the past 4 years. She had watched companies merge, separate, celebrate, and sometimes quietly disappear. Most executives never remembered the people who refilled their cups. She preferred it that way. Remaining unnoticed had become a habit, almost a form of protection. The visitor nodded once, as though confirming something only he understood. Interesting, he said softly. Some of the most important people in a room are often the ones nobody introduces. Ethan smiled politely, though the confidence behind it had begun to thin. Miss Brooks is exceptionally professional, he replied. Our guests always receive excellent service. Naomi offered a courteous nod without speaking. Compliments about her professionalism had become familiar over the years. They were safe, predictable. They required nothing from anyone except polite acknowledgement. Yet today's conversation felt different. It was drifting toward a place she had spent years avoiding. She reached for an empty porcelain cup near the end of the table, her reflection briefly appearing across its glossy surface before disappearing beneath the bright conference lights. As she turned, another glimpse of the open binder caught her attention. The highlighted sentence remained partially visible between two pages. Her memory completed the words before her eyes fully read them. She remembered reviewing language almost identical to it inside a financial institution in New York nearly 6 years earlier. Back then, she had spent entire nights comparing acquisition agreements line by line because one misplaced phrase could shift billions of dollars in legal responsibility. She could still hear her former mentor repeating the same lesson. Never trust the summary. Trust the wording. Naomi quietly closed her eyes for the briefest second. Those days belonged to another life. Another version of herself before her mother's illness changed every priority she had ever known. When medical appointments replaced board meetings and hospital corridors replaced airport lounges, impressive titles stopped mattering. Stability mattered. Time mattered. Family mattered. She had never regretted the decision, even when employers later questioned the long gap on her resume instead of asking why it existed. Ethan resumed the presentation, inviting everyone to review the final documentation before signatures. Leather folders opened almost simultaneously around the table. Expensive fountain pens appeared one after another. Naomi began wheeling the serving cart toward the doorway, determined to leave before memories persuaded her to notice anything more. Then, as Ethan turned another page, the folded blue tab slipped completely aside. The entire clause became visible for one unmistakable heartbeat, and Naomi stopped walking. Naomi remained motionless, her hand resting lightly against the polished steel handle of the serving cart while the highlighted clause seemed to glow beneath the conference room lights. The wording was almost elegant in its simplicity, which made it even more dangerous. It did not openly transfer authority. It quietly redefined responsibility after execution, placing future liabilities on one side while preserving broad discretionary rights for the other. Most readers would never notice the difference because the language sounded reassuring instead of alarming. She had watched seasoned executives overlook similar wording before, trusting summaries prepared by associates instead of reading every sentence themselves. Ethan Caldwell uncapped his fountain pen and slid the signature page closer. Around him, legal advisors exchanged confident nods. One analyst whispered projected revenue figures, while another adjusted a spreadsheet that displayed optimistic forecasts stretching 5 years into the future. The atmosphere had changed, from careful negotiation to anticipated celebration. Someone even joked about making dinner reservations before the market closed. Naomi slowly lowered her eyes. None of this belonged to her anymore. She reminded herself that she was scheduled to serve lunch in another executive suite within 40 minutes. Her supervisor expected every tray returned to the service kitchen spotless. She had learned long ago that excellence in small responsibilities carried its own quiet dignity. Yet the words inside the binder refused to leave her mind. They echoed alongside an older memory from another glass tower years earlier, when a senior partner had looked across a conference table and told her, "The most expensive mistakes are usually hidden inside the calmest paragraphs." That lesson had shaped her entire career. It had also saved clients who never realized how close they had come to disaster. Naomi inhaled slowly. She could smell fresh coffee, polished wood, and the faint citrus fragrance from the flowers arranged near the windows. Outside, a commuter train crossed the river far below, appearing no larger than a silver ribbon beneath the bright Chicago sky. Life continued normally beyond the glass, while inside the boardroom, billions of dollars balanced upon words that almost no one was reading carefully anymore. The visitor from Zurich had not opened his own contract. Instead, he quietly observed Ethan with patient curiosity, as though waiting to discover whether confidence would outweigh caution. His colleagues mirrored his restraint, leaving their pens untouched. Ethan noticed their hesitation and smiled reassuringly. "Our attorneys have reviewed every revision," he said. "There is nothing unexpected remaining in these documents." The statement sounded sincere. Naomi believed he genuinely trusted the people surrounding him. That, somehow, made the moment even heavier. Trust was valuable. Blind trust was expensive. She turned the serving cart another few inches toward the exit before stopping again. Her grandmother's voice surfaced from a memory she had not visited in years. "If you already know someone is walking toward a hole, silence becomes a choice too." Naomi closed her eyes for a heartbeat. Speaking would almost certainly embarrass powerful people who had already dismissed her. Remaining silent would allow the meeting to continue exactly as planned. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the silver tray. Across the room, Ethan positioned his pen above the signature line, while every conversation faded into complete stillness. Naomi heard her own heartbeat, steady and measured. Then she looked up from the serving cart, fixed her eyes on the open binder, and realized she could no longer pretend she had not seen it. The silence stretched so long that even the quiet hum of the ventilation system seemed unusually loud. Ethan Caldwell lowered the tip of his fountain pen toward the signature line with complete confidence, never noticing that the members of the Zurich delegation had still not uncapped theirs. Naomi Brooks felt the familiar battle between instinct and restraint settle heavily inside her chest. For 4 years, she had succeeded by remaining invisible, by understanding that every elegant boardroom had unspoken rules and that service staff were expected to move quietly, smile politely, and leave without becoming part of the story. She had followed those rules every single day. But another rule had been taught to her long before she ever entered corporate finance. Integrity did not disappear simply because your job title changed. She watched Ethan's pen pause less than an inch above the paper. One signature. That was all it would take. The highlighted clause would quietly reshape the agreement after execution, leaving Caldwell Global responsible for risks the presentation slides had never mentioned. Nobody appeared to notice. Nobody except her. Naomi slowly released her grip on the serving cart. The wheels gave a barely audible click against the hardwood floor as she stepped forward. It was a tiny sound, yet several heads turned instinctively. She immediately wondered if she should stop, apologize, and leave the room before making an impossible mistake. Then she remembered the countless evenings spent beside her mother's hospital bed, listening to the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise her. Doing the right thing is rarely convenient, her mother used to say. That is why so few people choose it. Naomi took one more careful step. Her heartbeat remained steady. Not because she felt fearless, but because she had already accepted that speaking might cost her the only stable job she had left. Ethan noticed the movement from the corner of his eye and looked up with polite impatience. "Is there something you need?" he asked, expecting perhaps another coffee refill. Naomi hesitated for only a second. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice respectful but unmistakably clear, "before anyone signs, would you please read the liability language on page 47 one more time?" The words floated through the boardroom with surprising softness, yet every conversation ended immediately. One executive slowly leaned back in his chair. Another blinked in disbelief before looking toward Ethan. The lead attorney frowned as though trying to decide whether he had heard correctly. Ethan's expression hardened with confusion more than anger. "Excuse me?" Naomi kept her hands folded calmly in front of her. "There is one paragraph that deserves another look." A brief laugh escaped from the far end of the table. It was followed by another, quieter this time, uncertain whether amusement was still appropriate. One vice president shook his head almost imperceptibly. The attorney closest to Ethan adjusted his glasses before speaking. "Miss Brooks," he said with professional courtesy, "our legal team has reviewed this agreement for months." Naomi nodded gently. "I believe that, sir." She did not raise her voice. She did not argue. "I am only asking that page 47 be read one more time before the ink touches the paper." Across the room, the visitor from Zurich remained perfectly still. For the first time since entering the boardroom, a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, not because anyone had spoken loudly, but because someone had finally chosen to speak at all. No one reached for a signature after that. The room seemed to hold its breath as every pair of eyes shifted from Naomi Brooks to Ethan Caldwell and then back again. The attorney seated beside Ethan let out a restrained laugh that echoed more awkwardly than confidently through the boardroom. "With respect," he said, folding his hands over the contract, "this agreement has been reviewed by 3 law firms, 2 compliance teams, and outside counsel on both sides. I do not believe we require legal advice from the catering staff." A few executives smiled politely, relieved that someone had restored what they considered the proper order of the room. Ethan remained silent for a moment before looking toward Naomi with measured composure. "Miss Brooks," he said, "I appreciate your concern, but these negotiations involve years of preparation. Please allow our team to finish." His words were calm, yet they carried the unmistakable weight of dismissal. Naomi felt the warmth rise in her face, not from embarrassment alone, but from knowing exactly how this moment appeared to everyone watching. A woman in a service uniform had interrupted a billion-dollar negotiation. Every instinct told her to apologize, collect the empty coffee cups, and quietly disappear through the service hallway before she became the story people laughed about over lunch. Her fingers tightened gently around the silver tray. She could already imagine her supervisor receiving complaints before the afternoon was over. Perhaps she would lose the assignment, perhaps even the job itself. The thought frightened her more than she wanted to admit. Even so, another thought refused to leave. If she walked away now, she would spend the rest of her life wondering whether silence had cost someone everything. Ethan lowered his pen toward the contract again. "We are ready to proceed," he announced to the delegation from Zurich. Before anyone else could move, the gray-haired visitor calmly closed his own binder. The soft sound of leather meeting polished wood was barely audible, yet it stopped the room more effectively than any raised voice. "We are not," he replied. Every executive turned toward him. Ethan blinked once. "May I ask why?" The visitor rested both hands lightly on the table. "Because someone in this room has asked for one additional review, and I have learned never to ignore the only person willing to slow down a room that is eager to hurry." The attorney leaned forward. "Sir, I assure you there is no reason for concern." The visitor offered a courteous smile. Then, reading one page again should require only a minute. No one answered. The silence stretched across the polished table, while sunlight reflected softly from the skyline beyond the glass walls. Naomi remained exactly where she stood. She did not argue. She did not attempt to explain the clause. She simply waited. Ethan studied her expression, expecting uncertainty, perhaps regret. Instead, he found remarkable calm. She was not trying to prove herself right. She simply looked like someone carrying information she wished had never become her responsibility. That quiet certainty unsettled him far more than confidence would have. Without another word, the visitor slowly turned his contract back to the section marked by the blue tab. One by one, members of his delegation did the same. Around the table, executives who moments earlier had smiled now began opening their own binders again. The room had changed, not because anyone believed Naomi yet, but because no one could completely ignore her anymore. The quiet rustle of turning pages replaced every conversation in the room. Thick contract binders opened almost in unison, and for the first time that morning, the polished confidence surrounding the table gave way to careful reading. Ethan Caldwell leaned forward, following the blue tab until he reached page 47. His attorney shifted closer, already pointing toward the highlighted paragraph with the assurance of someone expecting to settle the matter within seconds. Naomi Brooks remained where she stood beside the serving cart, her hands folded calmly in front of her. She deliberately looked away from the table and toward the windows, overlooking the Chicago skyline. She had said everything she intended to say. Now the document needed to speak for itself. The visitor from Zurich read in complete silence. His colleagues did the same, each tracing the paragraph line by line instead of skimming the page. Nearly a full minute passed without anyone speaking. The only sounds came from distant traffic below and the faint ticking of an elegant wall clock mounted beside the conference room entrance. Ethan's attorney finally broke the silence with a reassuring smile. As expected, he said, "The clause simply allocates operational responsibility after closing." Ethan gave a small nod, appearing ready to move forward again. Then the visitor quietly raised one finger without lifting his eyes from the document. "Please continue reading," he said. The attorney frowned slightly but complied. His confident expression remained unchanged for another few seconds before the smile gradually disappeared. He adjusted his glasses. "Read the sentence again, then once more." Ethan noticed the subtle change immediately. "Is there something wrong?" he asked. "No," the attorney answered too quickly. "I simply want to verify the wording." Naomi recognized that tone. She had heard it years ago whenever experienced professionals realized they might have overlooked something obvious. Confidence became caution almost instantly. Across the table, another lawyer from the Zurich delegation quietly circled one sentence with a pencil before sliding the binder toward his colleague without saying a word. They exchanged a brief look that required no explanation. Ethan leaned closer. "What are you seeing?" The attorney did not answer immediately. Instead, he flipped backward 3 pages, then forward again, comparing definitions, references, and cross-citations. His breathing slowed. The room seemed smaller now. Even the executives who had laughed earlier stopped pretending to check their phones. Every eye remained fixed on the legal team. Naomi kept her gaze lowered. She remembered exactly why the wording was so dangerous. The clause itself did not create the risk. The definition hidden earlier in the agreement quietly changed the meaning of 2 ordinary words. Separately, each paragraph looked harmless. Together, they shifted future liability in a way that few readers would notice until years later. Ethan watched his attorney underline the same sentence twice. "Talk to me," he said, his voice noticeably quieter than before. Before the attorney could respond, the visitor gently closed his binder and looked directly at Ethan. "Your employee was correct to request another review," he said. Ethan instinctively glanced toward Naomi. "She is not my employee," he replied. The visitor offered a calm smile. "Perhaps not on paper." His eyes returned to Naomi for only a moment. "But she may be the only person in this room who recognized the document before recognizing the titles around it." The room fell silent once again, but this silence no longer carried amusement. It carried uncertainty. The attorney removed his glasses and carefully cleaned the lenses with a folded handkerchief, buying himself a few extra seconds before speaking. No one interrupted him. The confidence that had filled the boardroom less than 10 minutes earlier had dissolved into something quieter, heavier, more deliberate. Ethan Caldwell watched every movement across the table, sensing that the atmosphere had shifted in a way no presentation slide could repair. The visitor from Zurich remained composed, his hands resting lightly on the closed binder, as though he had already reached his conclusion. Finally, Ethan's attorney looked up. "There is a definition buried in the preliminary provisions," he said slowly. "It changes the interpretation of operational responsibility after execution." Ethan frowned. "Meaning?" The attorney swallowed before answering. "Meaning the language appears balanced until it is read together with the earlier definition. Combined, the 2 sections assign substantially broader liability to Caldwell Global than our summary indicates." The room became perfectly still. One executive quietly lowered his pen onto the table. Another slowly closed his laptop without taking his eyes off the contract. Across the table, one member of the Zurich delegation nodded almost imperceptibly, confirming the same conclusion without speaking. Ethan reached for the binder himself and carefully reread the highlighted paragraph, then flipped backward to the definitions section exactly where his attorney pointed. His eyes moved across the page once, then again, slower the second time. The confidence in his posture began to soften. "How did we miss this?" he asked quietly. No one answered immediately. The attorney looked genuinely unsettled. "Because every review focused on the clause itself," he admitted. "The real change is hidden inside a revised definition that appears harmless by itself. Unless both sections are read together, the transfer of future exposure is almost impossible to recognize." Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring silently at the contract. Around him, executives who had entered the meeting expecting a routine signing now exchanged uncertain glances. The polished certainty that usually accompanied experienced leadership had given way to honest self-questioning. Naomi Brooks remained beside the serving cart without moving. She kept her eyes lowered, resisting every temptation to explain further. She had not spoken to prove anyone wrong. She had spoken because the document deserved another reading. That had always been enough for her. The visitor from Zurich finally looked toward Naomi again. "May I ask you a question, Miss Brooks?" She lifted her eyes respectfully. "Yes, sir. When you asked for page 47 to be reviewed, had you already recognized the definition referenced on page 12? Naomi hesitated for only a moment before answering honestly. "Yes, sir." Several heads turned toward her at once. Ethan looked up from the contract with visible surprise. "You noticed both?" Naomi nodded gently. "The clause alone is not the problem. It only becomes one after the earlier definition changes what the later language actually means." Another long silence settled across the room. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody questioned why she had spoken. They were no longer looking at the woman who had entered carrying coffee. They were looking at someone whose understanding of the agreement had reached beyond every summary prepared for the meeting. Ethan slowly closed the binder and rested both hands on its cover. For the first time since the negotiations had begun, he realized he did not know who Naomi Brooks really was. No one asked Naomi Brooks to leave the room. That change alone said more than any apology could have. Only minutes earlier, she had been treated as part of the background. Another quiet professional expected to refill coffee without interrupting conversations worth billions of dollars. Now, every executive in the boardroom seemed to measure their next words with unusual care. Ethan Caldwell slowly turned the binder toward himself again, reading the disputed pages one final time before closing it with deliberate precision. The sharp sound echoed softly across the polished table. He looked toward his legal team, searching their faces for reassurance, but found only thoughtful silence. If we had signed today, he asked quietly, what would the long-term exposure have been? The senior attorney answered with visible honesty. Potentially hundreds of millions of dollars over the life of the agreement. Depending on future claims and regulatory actions, no one reached for a calculator. No one needed exact numbers anymore. Everyone in the room understood the scale. Ethan leaned back in his chair and stared for a moment at the skyline beyond the glass walls. The Chicago River reflected the afternoon sun in bright silver ribbons while traffic moved normally through the streets below. It struck him how ordinary the city looked, despite the fact that his company had come within a single signature of accepting extraordinary risk. He slowly returned his attention to Naomi. "You recognize this in less than a minute," he said. She answered with the same calm that had carried her through every uncomfortable moment since speaking. "I recognize the pattern, sir." Ethan tilted his head slightly. Patterns like this are not usually recognized by hospitality staff. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly before replying. "No, sir. They are not." The room waited. She did not volunteer another explanation, and somehow her restraint made everyone even more curious. The visitor from Zurich rested both hands on the table and finally spoke again. "Miss Brooks understands that documents tell stories," he said. Most people only read the headlines. Ethan studied Naomi more carefully than he had all morning. Her uniform was perfectly pressed. Her black name tag remained clipped neatly above her pocket. Nothing about her appearance suggested someone capable of identifying legal language that experienced specialists had overlooked. Yet appearances had already proven unreliable once today. One of the younger analysts quietly searched Naomi's name on his tablet beneath the table, expecting to find nothing more than an employee profile from the hotel. His expression changed almost immediately. He frowned, typed again, then looked up at Naomi before returning to the screen. The movement caught Ethan's attention. "Did you find something?" he asked. The analyst hesitated. "I am not sure yet." He continued searching, opening archived business articles and old financial conference programs. The room remained silent except for the faint tapping of his keyboard. After another few seconds, he looked toward Ethan with unmistakable disbelief. "Sir," he said carefully, "I think there is someone here you should know about." Ethan accepted the tablet and read the first headline. His eyes narrowed. He scrolled farther, then farther still. Each article carried the same photograph, taken years earlier at international finance conferences, investment forums, and corporate negotiations. The woman in those pictures looked younger, dressed in tailored business suits instead of a service uniform, but her calm eyes were impossible to mistake. Ethan slowly lifted his gaze from the screen to Naomi Brooks. For the second time that day, the room became completely silent. But this silence was no longer driven by uncertainty. It was driven by recognition. The tablet rested motionless in Ethan Caldwell's hands, while the room waited for him to speak. Instead, he continued scrolling through article after article, each one revealing another chapter of a career no one inside the boardroom had imagined. There were photographs of Naomi Brooks, standing beside international finance ministers, speaking on conference stages in New York, London, and Singapore, and receiving recognition for leading some of the most complex cross-border acquisitions of her generation. Another article described how she had become known for detecting hidden contractual risks that other review teams routinely overlooked. Ethan looked up slowly. The woman standing quietly beside the serving cart was the same woman smiling confidently in those photographs. Yet the years between those images seemed to tell a story no headline explained. "Is this really you?" he asked softly. Naomi nodded once. "Yes, sir." No pride entered her voice. No embarrassment either, only simple honesty. Ethan looked back at the tablet. Vice President of Strategic Transactions, he read aloud. Northbridge International Capital, the younger analyst quietly added. She was also listed among the top merger advisors under 40 in one of the financial journals that year. Another executive leaned closer to read the screen for himself. Why would someone leave a career like this? He asked almost to himself. Naomi remained silent for several seconds. Outside, clouds drifted slowly across the bright afternoon sky, softening the sunlight that spilled across the conference table. The reflection on the polished wood shifted gently, and for a moment the room felt less like a battlefield of status and more like a place where ordinary human lives quietly crossed paths. My mother became ill, Naomi finally said. She needed someone with her every day. No one interrupted. I thought it would be a temporary pause, she continued. But treatments lasted longer than expected. Then came rehabilitation, home care, and eventually hospice. By the time she passed away, nearly 4 years had gone by. Her voice remained steady, though every word carried the weight of lived experience. When I tried to return, employers saw the employment gap before they saw the experience. Some questioned whether I still understood the industry. Others assumed I had fallen behind. A few interviews ended before they truly began. She offered a small smile that carried neither bitterness nor self-pity. The hotel offered honest work. It paid my bills. It allowed me to rebuild one day at a time. Silence settled over the room once again, but it no longer felt uncomfortable. Ethan lowered the tablet onto the table with unusual care. He remembered the way he had dismissed her earlier without even asking her name. He remembered reducing a human being to a uniform, because that was all he had allowed himself to see. Across the table, the visitor from Zurich folded his hands. Titles disappear more quickly than character, he said quietly. That is why we pay attention to both. Ethan nodded almost absent-mindedly, still looking at Naomi. The realization settled slowly inside him that the greatest expertise in the room had never been seated at the conference table. It had been standing quietly against the wall, carrying coffee instead of credentials, waiting for no recognition at all. For the first time in many years, Ethan found himself questioning not the contract in front of him, but the assumptions he had carried into the room before the meeting had even begun. No one spoke for several long seconds after Naomi finished. The silence no longer carried surprise. It carried reflection. Sunlight drifted across the conference table as clouds moved beyond the towering windows, leaving soft bands of light on polished walnut and neatly stacked contracts. Ethan Caldwell rested both hands on the closed binder, his attention fixed not on the billion-dollar agreement, but on the woman who had quietly protected his company without expecting recognition. The visitor from Zurich finally broke the silence. Miss Brooks, he said, would you be willing to join us at the table? Naomi looked briefly toward the serving cart. A fresh pot of coffee still rested on its warming plate, and several empty cups remained on the lower shelf waiting to be collected. Old habits were difficult to leave behind. I am working today, sir, she answered politely. So are we, the visitor replied with a gentle smile. The only difference is that your work has already proven more valuable than ours. A faint ripple of quiet laughter eased the tension that had gripped the room for the past hour. Ethan slowly stood from his chair. Around the table, several executives instinctively did the same without realizing it. He walked toward Naomi, stopping a respectful distance away. His voice was noticeably different from when the meeting had begun. It had lost the certainty that titles alone could provide. Miss Brooks, he said, would you do us the honor of reviewing the revised agreement before anyone signs it? Naomi hesitated. Your legal team is fully capable of completing that review, sir. Ethan nodded. They are capable. He glanced toward the binder before looking back at her. Today proved that capable people still benefit from another set of experienced eyes. The senior attorney spoke next, his expression carrying none of the defensiveness from earlier. I would welcome your perspective. Naomi searched each face around the table. She found no ridicule, no impatience, only genuine expectation. Slowly, she set the silver serving tray onto the cart, removed a simple pair of reading glasses from the front pocket of her uniform, and stepped toward the conference table. The movement felt almost unreal, as though two completely different seasons of her life had quietly met in the same room. The visitor from Zurich pulled out the empty chair beside him. Please, Naomi sat carefully, smoothing the sleeves of her hotel uniform before opening the revised binder. Her fingertips moved naturally across the pages, marking references, comparing definitions, and tracing legal cross-citations with calm precision. It felt familiar, not because she had never left this world, but because knowledge had never truly left her. 20 minutes passed without interruption. Occasionally, she asked for supporting schedules. Once she requested the earlier draft of a financing appendix. The attorneys located each document immediately. Nobody questioned why. When she finally closed the binder, she looked toward both negotiating teams. "The revised language is balanced now," she said quietly. "Each party assumes responsibility only for obligations it directly controls. The definitions are consistent throughout the agreement." The visitor smiled with unmistakable satisfaction. "Excellent." He reached into his portfolio and removed a fountain pen before sliding the contract toward Ethan. "Now," he said warmly, "I believe we are finally negotiating with everyone who belongs in this room." The revised agreement rested at the center of the conference table. Every correction carefully incorporated, every definition verified, every hidden ambiguity removed. The atmosphere inside the room felt completely different from the one that had existed only an hour earlier. The urgency had disappeared. In its place was something far rarer in high finance. Trust built through humility rather than confidence alone. The visitor from Zurich reviewed the final pages one last time before placing his signature neatly beneath the amended terms. One after another, members of both legal teams followed. Each signature landed with quiet certainty instead of hurried momentum. Ethan Caldwell picked up his fountain pen but paused before adding his name. He looked across the table toward Naomi Brooks, who had already returned her reading glasses to the pocket of her uniform. She had quietly gathered the loose documents into neat stacks while the attorneys completed their final review, almost as though she expected to fade back into the background the moment her work was finished. Ethan slowly stood. The movement immediately drew every eye in the room. He walked around the polished conference table until he stopped beside Naomi. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The city skyline shimmered behind them beneath the afternoon sun, filling the room with warm reflections that softened the sharp lines of glass and steel. "Miss Brooks," Ethan said at last, "before this meeting began, I saw your uniform before I saw you. That was my mistake." The words were simple. They carried no dramatic flourish, only quiet sincerity. Naomi met his eyes with the same calm expression she had worn throughout the day. "Thank you, sir," she replied gently. Ethan lowered his gaze for a moment before continuing. "You protected my company after I dismissed your voice. You had every reason to remain silent." Naomi smiled softly. "The agreement did not care who read it, sir. It only cared whether someone read it carefully." Several people around the table exchanged thoughtful glances. Even the senior attorney allowed himself a quiet smile. The visitor from Zurich nodded with visible approval. "That," he said, "is the answer of someone who understands responsibility better than authority." Ethan extended his hand. Naomi accepted it without hesitation. There was no applause, no celebration, only a respectful handshake between two people who now understood each other differently than they had that morning. Ethan released her hand and turned toward the conference table. Without another word, he signed the corrected agreement. The remaining signatures followed within minutes. The final page was carefully placed inside a leather portfolio, and the visitor from Zurich closed it with quiet satisfaction. "Congratulations," he said warmly. "Today we completed more than a successful transaction. We proved that careful judgment is still the most valuable asset any organization can possess." As the meeting concluded, executives gathered their folders more slowly than usual. Several approached Naomi individually, thanking her for her insight with genuine respect instead of polite formality. She answered every conversation with the same grace, never mentioning what had happened earlier, never reminding anyone how quickly they had underestimated her. She simply smiled, wished each person a successful afternoon, and began returning the conference room to perfect order, placing empty coffee cups onto the silver tray with the same care she had shown before anyone knew her name. By late afternoon, the conference room had returned to its familiar stillness. The projection screen had gone dark. The leather chairs had been pushed neatly beneath the polished walnut table, and the contracts that had occupied everyone's attention only hours earlier were now locked safely inside secure portfolios. on their way to become one of the largest completed transactions of the year. Naomi Brooks wiped the last faint fingerprint from the glass tabletop with the same careful motions she had used every day for the past 4 years. Nothing about her routine had changed, yet everything around her somehow had. She placed the folded cleaning cloth back onto the silver cart and paused beside the floor-to-ceiling windows. Below, the Chicago River reflected the warm colors of the setting sun while commuters filled sidewalks and trains with ordinary conversations, each person carrying burdens and victories invisible to everyone else. The quiet moment was interrupted by soft footsteps behind her. Ethan Caldwell approached, without the hurried confidence that had defined him earlier that morning. He carried no contract, no tablet, and no presentation folder. Only a small white business card rested between his fingers. He stopped beside her, looking out over the skyline before speaking. "When I built my company," he said quietly, "I believed the greatest risk was making the wrong investment. Today I learned the greater risk is failing to recognize the right person." Naomi smiled gently but kept her eyes on the city beyond the glass. "We all overlook things sometimes, sir," she answered. Ethan shook his head with quiet honesty. "I overlooked a person." He extended the business card toward her. It bore only his direct phone number beneath his name. "If you ever decide to return to finance, I hope you will allow me the opportunity to earn the conversation I should have started this morning." Naomi accepted the card with both hands, studying it for a brief moment before carefully placing it inside the pocket of her uniform. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "I will remember your kindness." Ethan smiled. "No, I hope you remember my lesson." They shared a quiet laugh before standing together in comfortable silence. Down the hallway, several employees passed by the open doorway. Earlier that morning, many of them had hurried past Naomi without a second glance. Now, each one slowed just enough to offer a warm greeting, a respectful nod, or a genuine smile before continuing on. None of those gestures were requested. None were performed for appearance. Respect had replaced assumption in the smallest, most ordinary ways. Naomi gathered the silver serving tray and quietly rolled the cart toward the service elevator. As the doors opened, she stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor. Just before the doors closed, Ethan looked up once more. Their eyes met for only a second. He nodded with quiet gratitude. Naomi returned the gesture, and the doors slid shut without another word. The elevator descended through the building while the golden light of evening faded across the glass towers outside. Somewhere above, executives would remember the agreement that protected a billion-dollar company. But long after the numbers were forgotten, another memory would remain. A woman wearing a simple service uniform had walked into a room where no one expected her voice to matter. She never raised that voice. She never demanded respect. She simply chose integrity over silence, and in doing so reminded everyone present that true worth is never measured by a title, a salary, or the clothes someone wears. It is revealed in the quiet moments when character speaks before status ever has the chance.